Pocas universidades en el mundo llevan el nombre de todo un país. Esta es la Universidad de Chile. Su nombre es reflejo de una misión y un compromiso: guiar el desarrollo de Chile en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. Investigamos el origen de la vida en laboratorios naturales únicos. Buscamos respuestas y soluciones para hacer posible un mejor futuro, sin importar las distancias ni los obstáculos, trabajando en conexión con la sociedad a lo largo y ancho de esta tierra de extremos y contrastes. Somos la Universidad de Chile. Estamos en el corazón de este país, vinculando ideas y personas para conocer nuestro pasado milenario y avanzar en la comprensión del universo. Contamos con la mayor infraestructura universitaria de Chile, distribuida en 5 campus y múltiples otros recintos dedicados a la formación, la investigación, la creación y la vinculación con la comunidad. Aquí se preserva y fortalece la más amplia red artística, cultural y patrimonial de nuestra nación. Somos la principal universidad del país y una de las más importantes de Latinoamérica. Lideramos la producción científica nacional en todas las disciplinas, con investigaciones que destacan con el nivel de impacto más alto en toda la región. Esta es nuestra casa y la de todos los chilenos y chilenas. Aquí trabajamos para hacer realidad nuestros sueños y aportar un legado de prosperidad para el mundo, ampliando los límites del conocimiento y la creación. En estas aulas, bibliotecas y laboratorios e incluso en algunos de los lugares más extremos del hemisferio sur. Formamos a los profesionales y especialistas que han construido esta nación y a intelectuales que han trascendido nuestras fronteras como referentes internacionales de la ciencia, la cultura y las artes. Unidos en esta diversidad de paisajes, colores, personas e ideas, construimos una comunidad sin fronteras. Juntos, desde múltiples disciplinas, estamos comprometidos con los grandes problemas de la humanidad, conectados para desplazar los límites del conocimiento y forjar nuestro futuro, derribando todo tipo de obstáculos. Trabajamos desde Latinoamérica en alianza con las principales universidades y centros de investigación del planeta. Esta es la Universidad de Chile, una comunidad vinculada con el mundo para formar, investigar y crear en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. La universidad, donde se vive la experiencia de todo un país. Pocas universidades en el mundo llevan el nombre de todo un país. Esta es la Universidad de Chile. Su nombre es reflejo de una misión y un compromiso: guiar el desarrollo de Chile en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. Investigamos el origen de la vida en laboratorios naturales únicos. Buscamos respuestas y soluciones para hacer posible un mejor futuro, sin importar las distancias ni los obstáculos, trabajando en conexión con la sociedad a lo largo y ancho de esta tierra de extremos y contrastes. Somos la Universidad de Chile. Estamos en el corazón de este país, vinculando ideas y personas para conocer nuestro pasado milenario y avanzar en la comprensión del universo. Contamos con la mayor infraestructura universitaria de Chile, distribuida en 5 campus y múltiples otros recintos dedicados a la formación, la investigación, la creación y la vinculación con la comunidad. Aquí se preserva y fortalece la más amplia red artística, cultural y patrimonial de nuestra nación. Somos la principal universidad del país y una de las más importantes de Latinoamérica. Lideramos la producción científica nacional en todas las disciplinas, con investigaciones que destacan con el nivel de impacto más alto en toda la región. Esta es nuestra casa y la de todos los chilenos y chilenas. Aquí trabajamos para hacer realidad nuestros sueños y aportar un legado de prosperidad para el mundo, ampliando los límites del conocimiento y la creación. En estas aulas, bibliotecas y laboratorios e incluso en algunos de los lugares más extremos del hemisferio sur. Formamos a los profesionales y especialistas que han construido esta nación y a intelectuales que han trascendido nuestras fronteras como referentes internacionales de la ciencia, la cultura y las artes. Unidos en esta diversidad de paisajes, colores, personas e ideas, construimos una comunidad sin fronteras. Juntos, desde múltiples disciplinas, estamos comprometidos con los grandes problemas de la humanidad. Conectados para desplazar los límites del conocimiento y forjar nuestro futuro, derribando todo tipo de obstáculos. Trabajamos desde Latinoamérica en alianza con las principales universidades y centros de investigación del planeta. Esta es la Universidad de Chile, una comunidad vinculada con el mundo para formar, investigar y crear en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. La universidad, donde se vive la experiencia de todo un país. Pocas universidades en el mundo llevan el nombre de todo un país. Esta es la Universidad de Chile. Su nombre es reflejo de una misión y un compromiso: guiar el desarrollo de Chile en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. Investigamos el origen de la vida en laboratorios naturales únicos. Buscamos respuestas y soluciones para hacer posible un mejor futuro, sin importar las distancias ni los obstáculos, trabajando en conexión con la sociedad a lo largo y ancho de esta tierra de extremos y contrastes. Somos la Universidad de Chile. Estamos en el corazón de este país, vinculando ideas y personas para conocer nuestro pasado milenario y avanzar en la comprensión del universo. Contamos con la mayor infraestructura universitaria de Chile, distribuida en 5 campus y múltiples otros recintos dedicados a la formación, la investigación, la creación y la vinculación con la comunidad. Aquí se preserva y fortalece la más amplia red artística, cultural y patrimonial de nuestra nación. Somos la principal universidad del país y una de las más importantes de Latinoamérica. Lideramos la producción científica nacional en todas las disciplinas, con investigaciones que destacan con el nivel de impacto más alto en toda la región. Esta es nuestra casa y la de todos los chilenos y chilenas. Aquí trabajamos para hacer realidad nuestros sueños y aportar un legado de prosperidad para el mundo, ampliando los límites del conocimiento y la creación. En estas aulas, bibliotecas y laboratorios e incluso en algunos de los lugares más extremos del hemisferio sur. Formamos a los profesionales y especialistas que han construido esta nación y a intelectuales que han trascendido nuestras fronteras como referentes internacionales de la ciencia, la cultura y las artes. Unidos en esta diversidad de paisajes, colores, personas e ideas, construimos una comunidad sin fronteras. Juntos, desde múltiples disciplinas, estamos comprometidos con los grandes problemas de la humanidad. Conectados para desplazar los límites del conocimiento y forjar nuestro futuro, derribando todo tipo de obstáculos. Trabajamos desde Latinoamérica en alianza con las principales universidades y centros de investigación del planeta. Esta es la Universidad de Chile, una comunidad vinculada con el mundo para formar, investigar y crear en conexión con los grandes desafíos globales. La universidad, donde se vive la experiencia de todo un país.
All right, please, I'm going to start right now. So, all right, the presentation I will do in Spanish, all right? Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todos. Espero que estén muy bien y espero que estén disfrutando de los eventos que como organización hemos organizado con la colaboración de la universidad. Este es un día muy importante para todos nosotros, tanto para los que estudiamos economía como para los que nos enseñan economía, porque no todo el día, perdón, no todos los días tenemos la oportunidad de tener presente a alguien que ha contribuido tan significativamente a la economía y al mundo que nosotros estudiamos. Y el señor Stiglitz, profesor Stiglitz, no solamente va a participar en este evento, sino que nos mostrará y nos realizará un análisis crítico de la situación actual del mundo, nos explicará qué es el libre mercado y cómo esto afecta a la economía mundial. Por ende, quiero que le den un gran aplauso al economista y Premio Nobel de Economía, Joseph Stiglitz.
Well, I'm afraid in an hour I'm not going to be able to do everything that he promised. And in fact, I'm going to be a little bit shorter in my presentation, so we can have a little bit more time for questions, if that's all right with you. So what I'm going to really focus my attention on is in my remarks, is two ideas. One is neoliberalism and the many dimensions of its failure. And the other one is my view of the alternative to neoliberalism that I call progressive capitalism. So I'll try to outline those two set of ideas very briefly. I'm often more ambitious in preparing my talks than I realize time is. So I'm going to skip through some of this. Neoliberalism has become a term that's very fashionable both in Europe and in Latin America. In Latin America, often referred to as the influence of the Chicago boys. And as you know, your president, one of his big campaign statements that I loved was, if Chile was the place where neoliberalism was born, Chile will be the place where it will be buried. So one of the reasons I was so enthusiastic about coming to Chile is to watch the burial and to be at the funeral. But the unfortunate thing is that you may know an expression, a cat has 9 lives. Neoliberalism should have died many times before, and it seems very hard, really, to bury it. And that seems to be true even in Chile. So it's an ongoing struggle to try to bury neoliberalism, and maybe we'll talk a little bit why it has such survival value. But the interesting thing to me, one of the interesting aspects of this global discussion is that in the United States, finally in the last, I would say, 2 or 3 years, there has been a lot of discussion about the end of neoliberalism. In the export, it was one of the bad exports of the United States was, we should apologize, the export of Chicago ideas to the rest of the world, and I apologize for them. So finally in the United States, there's a beginning of a discussion of what does the world look like after the end of neoliberalism. So it's become a big subject of discussion and research. So what has happened in the last, let me begin, few years, I would say 20 years actually, has come to be a little bit of a shock to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, which was a set of ideas that you leave it to the market, you deregulate, you open up your economy to free trade, liberalize, you privatize, a whole bundle of ideas based on the notion that markets were efficient. Forget about fairness. That was not part of the agenda. Social justice was not part of the agenda. But efficiency was. The predictions of neoliberalism turned out not to be true. Neoliberalism that began, in the United States, we date it with the rise of Reagan and Thatcher, but in other parts of the world, like here, it has to do with the influence of Milton Friedman and the Chicago Boys under Pinochet. In other countries, its origins, but it was a set of ideas circulating around that time. It promised higher economic growth, and it basically said, don't worry about inequality because there'll be trickle-down economics. If we have higher growth, growth will benefit everybody, and even if the poor get a smaller fraction of society, the pie is so much bigger that everybody's getting a bigger pie, a slice of pie. And it turned out not to be true. The world turned out to be more unstable, more inefficient, growth was lower, and what growth occurred all went to the top. And the next chart shows some of this for Europe and the United States. The left-hand bar is growth before neoliberalism, and the right-hand bar is growth after neoliberalism. And what you see is growth slowed dramatically. This is a graph that shows how things are distributed. The dotted line is what the income of the top 1%. And you can see it moved way up. And at very rates, but it was unambiguously moving way up. Now there's a line at the bottom that looks like the horizontal axis, but it's not the horizontal axis. It's the average income, not at the bottom 10%, not the bottom 50%, it's the bottom 90% of Americans. What do you see about that? Well, it's very low. It looks like the horizontal axis. And if you have a microscope, you can see that it moved up. But it takes a microscope to see that it moved up. And, there's an expression, lies, damn lies, and statistics. And one of the things I assume you're being taught is how to lie with statistics. But this is not lying. These are just the raw numbers. I haven't processed them. I haven't done anything with them. I just graphed them. And this shows a very dramatic picture that while most Americans have not seen any increase in their income in a very, very long time, those in the top 1% have done very well. So when you say America is a very prosperous country, it's a little bit debatable. If you happen to choose the right pairings, and it's really important that you choose the right pairings. If you choose the right pairings, you will be in the 1% and you will do very well. But if you make a mistake, and this is really important, don't make the mistake of choosing the wrong parents, then you're in the bottom 90%, and your prospects are not very good. Actually, it's even worse. If you look at the real wage at the bottom in the United States, today they are lower than they were 65 years ago. Now, what that means is for 65 years, there's not been a pay raise for those unskilled workers at the bottom. And that's really, this is adjusted for inflation. So in real terms, they've not gotten a pay raise for 65 years. So if anybody says the American economy works, well, it does work for the top, but it has not been working for large fractions of the population. I could give you lots of more statistics, like life expectancy has been on decline. It's lower before the pandemic than it was many years before that. And of course, now with the pandemic, it's even lower. You know, some of the statistics that have just come out are just horrifying. If you look at it in racial terms, the average life expectancy of an indigenous American are lower than in any country in the Western Hemisphere other than Haiti. You know, the average in the United States is lower than in any of the other advanced countries. So income doesn't translate into general well-being. Now, one of the interesting things is about neoliberalism is that while it talked a lot about free markets, it wasn't really about free markets. In fact, there are a lot of inconsistencies that are really core to a lot of issues. So, for instance, the idea that is central to neoliberalism was leave it to the market. That was one of the Chicago School ideas. But the idea is leave it to the market until we need your money. And so in 2008, all these people in financial markets who kept criticizing government action said, we'll take your money, thank you. I was on a phone call, the financial markets collapsed in September of 2008. It was the middle of our presidential election campaign. So Bush was the president, but he was about not to become the president. And they wanted to have an economic policy that would persist if Obama became the president. And so they made a proposal, and then they discussed it with the Democrats, and President Obama got on the phone and talked to, we had a phone call with, you might say, mostly bankers and two or three economists, and I was one of the economists on the phone call. And to me, I was enjoying it just to watch what was going on as the banking system was collapsing. And the most interesting aspect of that phone call was one of the bankers said, and with others basically nodding, why only $700 billion? I don't know how many, $700 billion is a lot of money, just in case you don't know. That's a lot of money. And that was what Bush had proposed. And the point was the Democrats were supposed to bid more and say, we will give you more. And the combat from Obama was, oh, don't worry, if you need more money, there's more money there. The reason we said 700 billion is that if we said what we think we were going to give you, which is $1 trillion, that sounds too much. $1 trillion is 10 with how many zeros? I think 12 zeros. So that's even a bigger number. And so it was all PR that we would only, we'll announce 700 billion, but, if you need more money, come back. So this is from bankers who don't believe in any subsidies for anybody, and then I say, for anybody else. And that was what I saw all the time when I was in the White House. The other, they talked about deregulation, but whenever you use the word deregulation, you have to be very careful. Markets don't exist in a vacuum. They always operate on rules, laws, regulations. The question is, which rules and regulations? And what bankers mean by deregulation is, what they really mean is regulations that enrich the bankers. So another example was when nobody was paying any attention, the bankers succeeded in changing our bankruptcy laws so that when a bank goes bankrupt, or anybody goes bankrupt, the people who get paid first are derivatives that are issued by the banks. That was effectively a subsidy to the banks, to derivatives. It was an industrial policy in the sense that it encouraged the growth of derivatives. And the derivatives are what caused the financial crisis, or played a very big role in the propagation of the financial crisis. So the whole, when they talk about neoliberalism, they're not really talking about a free market economy. They are really talking about a particular kind of market economy shaped to benefit certain people. The third example is trade liberalization, and Chile has been one of the countries involved in trade liberalization. Right now you've just signed the TPP -1. They have a new fancy name for it, but it is the TPP -1. The interesting thing about trade liberalization, if you really had trade liberalization, what would it be? It would be a trade agreement that's about 3 pages long, not even that. I eliminate my tariffs, you eliminate yours. I eliminate my subsidies, you eliminate yours. That's it, right? That's free trade. Do you think the United States would ever sign a free trade agreement? No. We are not going to get rid of our agricultural subsidies, which is obviously very important to many of the countries in Latin America which export meat and soy and other products to America. We want you to take our products without tariffs, but we don't plan to reciprocate. These are managed trade agreements, managed for special interests in the United States. And they go well beyond trade. One of the reasons I opposed TPP when it was first proposed by Obama was they have a set of intellectual property provisions that made access to generic medicines more difficult. Really important in things like COVID-19, and these kind of provisions are provisions that have resulted in vaccine apartheid, people dying unnecessarily. Well, I call it a meeting of all the health negotiators of the TPP to try to explain how they had to change it if this wasn't going to cause massive deaths around the world, deterioration of health, and give just more money to the drug companies. And all of the health ministers showed up except one. Can you guess which one that was? The United States. Now, the good thing in the agreement that you have just signed is when the United States dropped out under President Trump, the others got together and said what I had said was right. And they deleted that from the agreement. So the agreement that you signed was nowhere near as bad as the one that the United States tried to foist on the world 8 years or so ago. But there's another provision that's also very interesting, which is the investment agreements that were also part of the Chile-American trade agreement. And those aren't about expropriation and protecting property rights. Those are about stopping regulation. But right now, and the right to regulate is a basic right of the state. Right now, what do we want to regulate? Really important. Well, 2008, we figured out we had not regulated banks. But what we've now learned is that we really need to regulate for the environment. Climate change is real. I thought it's real for 30 years, and I've been working on it for 30 years, but I think the world is now waking up to the reality of climate change. And that means we have to have climate regulations. But these agreements are going to make it very difficult to have those climate regulations. Now, interestingly, the major change between NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement between Mexico, United States, and Canada, and the agreement that was signed under Trump was they eliminated these provisions. Because Trump, he doesn't do very many things right, but this was one he did right. He thought it was an intrusion in our sovereignty in a fundamental way, and so they eliminated this. But TPP still has this provision in there, and I think what is interesting is Europe right now is going through a process of undoing the investment agreement because of climate change. And you're in the process of signing an agreement with these restrictions. So I hope that's giving you a little bit of just a picture both about what neoliberalism says it is and what it really is, which is not really what it is, it says it is, and the fact that it's failed. And the fact that it's failed should be so obvious at this point, both in terms of the lower growth, more inequality, a lack of resilience. American economy couldn't even produce baby formula. We have a massive shortage of baby formula even now. The economy wasn't resilient. We couldn't produce tests, masks, protective gear. I mean, it really has undermined the strength even of the American economy, let alone other economies. So there is this broad sense that neoliberalism is, or at least should be, dead. So I want to go on to talk a little bit about what should replace it. I spent a lot of time. You can probably get the slides through somebody. I describe what went wrong, what are the assumptions that are wrong, and all of that kind of stuff, and the criticism of the standard model. One of the interesting aspects of this whole debate about neoliberalism was that the theory underlying neoliberalism was already shown to be wrong before it became fashionable. I say that neoliberalism was based on the idea that markets on their own would lead to efficient outcomes. That was basically the idea of Adam Smith's invisible hand, that the pursuit of self-interest would lead, as if by an invisible hand, to the well-being of society. And one of the results of my own research was that the reason the invisible hand was invisible was it wasn't there. That is to say that markets were not, in general, efficient. Whenever there was imperfect information, incomplete risk markets, imperfect competition, externalities, public goods, and modern economies, these issues are pervasive. Environmental externalities, public health externalities, public goods like knowledge, which is the basis of the success of a 21st century economy. So the results, we had shown that the underlying hypothesis of neoliberalism just were wrong. I had Milton Friedman used to spend a lot of time there, and I visited Chicago, and so we used to have a lot of fights. The forum, I give a seminar where I would explain why markets were not efficient. And he would say, "You're wrong." And I would say to him, "Well, can you explain to me where in my assumptions I made a mistake, where in my analysis I made a mistake? Explain to me where I went wrong." I mean, it's possible I made a mistake. I was a little bit arrogant as a young person, so I didn't think it was likely, but it was possible. So, and he said, "I know that you're wrong." And we would go through this kind of ritual where I would present a result and he would say, "You're wrong," and I would say, "Explain to me," and he'd just say, "You're wrong." So our discussion never went very far, the result. But the point I want to make is that all the results, like that shareholder value maximization would lead to, was the optimal way of organizing a company. I showed with Sandy Grossman that that was wrong. That capital markets are informationally efficient. Again, Sandy Grossman, I showed that that was wrong. And so, we went through every one of the Chicago hypotheses and showed they were wrong. And they never repeated them. They just ignored them. That didn't make me feel good either. But they knew the answer. And I guess what I really learned from that is they weren't about economic science. It was about ideology. It was a set of beliefs not grounded in economic science. And then you ask the question, why did those ideas have such traction? Why were they bought by so many countries? Now, you can say in Chile you have an excuse because you had a dictator that didn't give you the choice. So but in many countries around the world, there were actually elections where they chose. And I think part of is that they were persuasive ideas. They were simple, I would say simplistic ideas. But they also served certain interests. And those interests made very powerful, had a lot of power and used their power to push that. And one of the real important things that I've come to focus a lot of my thinking on more recently is that the importance of the press in shaping public discourse. And when you have a press that is controlled by a few rich people like Murdoch controls Fox, that helps shape public discourse and public understanding, and why we ought to be really thinking much more of how do we create a more independent, diversified press, and think about how we create better institutions for fact-checking and verifying the truth in one way or another. So that's my rant about neoliberalism. Let me talk about what I view as the alternative, which I call progressive capitalism. Sometimes when I give this kind of talk in Europe, I talk about a reinvigorated, rejuvenated social democracy. And I really do think democracy is an important element of what we're talking about here, because it is one, you can't separate out economics from politics, because, as I said before, markets don't exist in a vacuum. They get structured by rules and regulations. Those rules and regulations get set by public policy. And if you don't have a democracy, if you have somebody, an elite, wealthy elite setting those, they will set them for their own interest. So you have to have some ways of checks to make sure that those rules, regulations that structure markets reflect broader societal interests. I can't quite see what is up there. Let me. Yeah. So. So what I mean by, sometimes we simplify and talk about markets versus government. And one of the things that I emphasize in the work of progressive capitalism is not only do you need rules and regulations, it's important to have a rich set of what I call an ecology of institutions that we needed to strengthen, have a balance between the market and the state. But in some countries, you need to strengthen the state. I feel that very strongly in the United States. We would not have been able, we responded to the COVID-19 so quickly because we had public investment in the mRNA platform. And then the government spent money to make sure that that got translated into a COVID-19 vaccine, and then it spent money to make sure that COVID-19 vaccine got produced very quickly. And it really was a enormous success of our society that we were able to identify and respond to this pathogen so quickly. But it was because of government. Pfizer never would have done it on its own. Pfizer makes a big deal about the role it played, but it based what it did on the enormous tens of billions of dollars of investment of the state. So that's just, and if we hadn't had the state to stop the economy going down, we would have had a depression worse than the Great Depression. So COVID-19 shows the importance of the state. But what I've been emphasizing more recently is not only do we need a state, a collective action takes many other forms, including civil society. And partly because the state gets captured. And so we need a decentralized way of collective action to, in a way, example of the ecology of institutions, each providing a check and balance against each other. In the United States, nonprofit institutions and even cooperatives play a very important role. And these are very different institutions. The only banks in the United States that were not guilty of excessive risk-taking and exploitation were the cooperatives. We have a very large cooperative banking system, and it worked well, and very different from the for-profit. The most important universities, most of the most important universities, not all, because we have very good state universities like University of California, Wisconsin, Illinois, lots of good, but a lot of the other institutions like Harvard, Columbia, Princeton, Stanford are not-for-profits. They're not state, but they're not for-profit. The example of a for-profit institution is Trump University, and it excelled on only one thing, figuring out how to exploit others. It was so bad that it had to pay millions of dollars in fines for its exploitation. So for-profit universities have been almost always, in the United States, I don't want to say anything about Chile, but have been almost always exploitive in the United States. The point is that progressive capitalism requires this rich ecology of institutions, realizes that there needs to be a lot of public investment, there needs to be regulation, that the markets on their own don't spend as much as they need to be spent for public goods like basic research, that they engage in excessive risk-taking, environmental exploitation of other people, of those who are most vulnerable. So we need public investment, regulation, but if we have public investment, we need taxation, and that has to be done in an appropriate way, fairly, equitably. So the notion of progressive capitalism is that in a complex world like we live, we have to decentralize. The old idea of central planning can't work. The information that is required to run a complex society can never be put in a single place. So it has to be decentralized. But then the question is, how do you coordinate a complex decentralized system? And the basic notion of progressive capitalism is prices are important, but they can't be unfettered. They have to be regulated, and the private sector has to be complemented by these other institutions that I've described. I think I've tried to outline just, or sketch basically what I view as this progressive capitalism. Maybe there's just one more thing that I might mention that for the United States I think is important, and that is the notion of what I call the public option. That, and that may have to do with the political economy in the United States, but it's the notion that among the rich ecology is that the public sector often can do things in competition with the private sector, and in some cases it can do it better, in which case we should let it do it better. And in some cases it may not do it as well, and then let the private sector do it. But having the public sector put forward a set of policies that are an option gives more vibrancy, more choice, more competition to the economy. One of the things I should have mentioned, one of the things that we've discovered is we don't live in a competitive economy, and it's getting less and less competitive. Several books have been written, including my own, about how we don't have, there's been such a marked decrease in competition in our economy in the last 40 years of neoliberalism. So the irony was liberalism was about free markets, but it meant taking away the regulations that would ensure we had free markets. So they stripped away the mechanism of ensuring that we actually had competition. And in sector after sector, we don't have competition. And the reason we had the baby formula shortage is that one company produced half of the baby formula in the United States. And then that company was discovered, its factories were unsafe. They were producing baby formula that was not safe for babies. And so they shut down the factory, and we had massive shortages. So the public option, in healthcare, in retirement pension schemes, I know that's a big issue here in Chile. The transaction costs in our Social Security system are a fraction, like 10% of that in the private sector. They're just much more efficient. And not a surprise, the private sector pays huge salaries, spends a lot of money in advertising. If you're going to scam people, you have to work at it. And they work very hard at scamming people, trying to tell them they're getting more than they're going to get, and persuading them to buy bad products. That takes money. And so they spend a lot of money in transaction costs. So one of the things I've argued is that we should have our public Social Security system be open for anybody to invest in it. And as I said, it's very, very efficient, very consumer responsive. One of the Medicare, which is our old age program, a program of healthcare for old age, one of the funny debates in the United States is during the Trump election in 2016, there were many campaign places where people would get up and vociferously say, I want government to keep its hands off of my Social Security and Medicare. What they didn't realize that Social Security and Medicare were government programs. The point is, they were so good, and they had been so doctrinated that anything good had to be private, that they believed that Social Security and Medicare were private. And so you had this discussion. I don't want government to touch Medicare and Social Security. It also was testimony for how bad our education system, that they wouldn't know that. Okay, so I think that this alternative, or some version of this alternative, has much better prospect of creating equality and efficiency and growth than neoliberalism, which has been a failure. Let me stop there and open up to questions.
Okay, now it's time for questions. If you have any question, o una pregunta, intervención, pueden hacerla sin ningún problema. Se les va a llevar el micrófono al puesto. ¿Alguien tiene una pregunta? Ahí al fondo.
Hello. Yeah, so first of all, thank you for being here. I think as a political scientist and economist, I read like thousands of papers about you. So it's very nice to see you there and like in person. And second of all, I would like to ask you, in order to reform the global economy, what do you think is the role today of the economic structures of colonization? So basically, how can developed countries actually compete with developing countries actually compete with developed countries in a better way, like with better structural conditions? How can we, for example, in Chile, develop further our industries with the tough competitions that we have against the global superpowers? And my second question goes more into what is happening in Chile today. Do you feel like the government of President Boric is more or less aligned with your ideas of progressive capitalism? Thank you.
Yeah, let me answer the second question. Yeah, I think they are more or less aligned. Now, he has a very big challenge because he has a Congress that doesn't always agree with me, let alone him. So we, politics is, you have to deal with political processes of convincing people, and there's always difficulties of interpretation of elections and referendum. I can talk about it in terms of President Biden. I think President Biden has had successful, but has done only a fraction of what he'd like to do. We've gotten a major bill to keep the U.S. economy going during the pandemic, an infrastructure bill, an industrial policy bill, a green energy bill, something that reduces healthcare costs, something for veterans. We've actually done an enormous amount in a very difficult political environment, but it is nowhere near what he aspired to do. And that's just the difficulty of politics and trying to persuade. But I do think that because we've had a lot of discussion of these ideas, that like the importance of the environment, it has made the idea of dealing with climate change much more possible. If we hadn't had that, it would not have been. If we hadn't worked so hard on this for a very long time, it would not have been possible. The first question about, how do small countries deal with a global environment, which much of which they don't control? I guess I'd make two broad comments. The first is, I think there needs to be more solidarity with the developing countries and emerging markets. In other words, they have to, their voice, any single country, Chile or even, a larger economy, doesn't have much voice. But when they act collectively, I think they might have more voice. Certainly they have more voice than they do when they don't act collectively. So I think that's the first thing. There needs to be more cohesion in recognizing the ways that the international system is tilted and trying to change some of the international rules that tilt it towards the advanced countries. The second thing is small countries have a big advantage because all they need to find is a set of niches where they can do well. Take Sweden. It would be difficult for Sweden to compete directly against Google or any of the tech giants. But they've been very successful with Spotify and some other. They figured out how to do a lot of innovation and insert themselves in the global economy in a very profitable way. And a lot of that has to do with human capital, education, understanding technology. So one of the advantages of the world we live with the internet is that distances have shrunk for many products. And that gives smaller countries, particularly those who are more distant, an opportunity, a set of opportunities that they didn't used to have. Martin, do you want to say anything? No. Okay.
Last question.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for being here, for presenting your ideas. I would like to kind of come back on the point you've just made about international relations, kind of go beyond that a little bit, or from the other side. I'm from the European Union, and I study here, and I'm constantly thinking about how to kind of create international relations between, for example, the European Union or the United States, the more developed countries, with regions like Latin America on the other side. And I feel like creating better international relations economically is not that easy, because on one hand, you don't want to make the same mistakes again of kind of neo-colonizing those regions. You don't want to like implement all the ideas we have in Europe and in North America and just say, hey, that's good, you should do that as well, or we know how you're supposed to create your economy. On the other hand, maybe there's some people, maybe not enough, but some people who would like to help those regions to get better economically, and we kind of had the problem that we need to foster environmental protection and like fight against climate change everywhere in the world and very quickly. And in Europe, at least, we're thinking about how to do that on an international scale as well. So how to make other countries to become more involved into climate protection. And for me, it feels kind of like a dilemma. On the one hand, we don't want to like dictate people or other countries, more developing countries, what to do. On the other hand, we have certain goals that we consider even positive for them or for like the whole world. How do you see like the future of international relations in that regard?
So, where I begin is first, because we share one planet, we have to, is the microphone on? Yeah. Because we share one planet, we have to solve common problems of that planet. And climate change is one, global health is another, and it's in all of our interest to do that and to do it well. And so that's not imposing anything on anybody. The South will suffer even more than in some ways than the North, because more of the South is in the tropics, and the tropics are likely to be more affected. I have to put a caveat. The United States has been losing almost 2% of GDP from climate change every year. And it's really foolish, I would say stupid, of the United States not to do more, because we are, in terms of physical property, we're losing a lot year after year. I mean, you just look at the newspaper, the wildfires, the hurricanes, the floods, it is incredible, and that we are still the most resistant to doing something about it. So to me, it's really quite incredible. But so the first point is, it's not imperialism, it's not colonialism, it is just you share a planet and you have to address the problems. It is particularly important for Europe and the United States to recognize this, because most of the emissions today are coming from the climate, from the global South, from the emerging and developing countries. So no matter how virtuous Europe is, it won't solve the climate problem unless it is working with the global South. And one of the things is working with the South to create their own institutions, their own ways of dealing with it. So one of the things that I feel very, almost proud about is I worked with the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, in the days where Russia was okay, India, China, and South Africa to create a new development bank that would be focused on lending for climate. And it was created, it's called the New Development Bank, and it's lending billions of dollars a year for projects in emerging markets and developing countries for climate. And so that, it's their own institution, and we helped broker that idea, and they were the ones who did it, and but we helped facilitate that process. So that seems to me key. The second thing is to try to recognize within our own countries the complexity of the political forces at play. And I guess I've been struck since I began my work in public policy back in the Clinton administration and then at the World Bank, the role of power, Wall Street, monopolists, and the difference between what is in the interest, say, of the American people and what the U.S. Treasury. That was what I was constantly having to fight. There's a big divergence. And so one of the big battles is to try to make it clear, both within the United States, that what the U.S. government was doing was not always in the interest of the American people, to try to persuade the U.S. government that it was not doing the right thing, and to enhance an understanding in other countries that when we do something, don't say Americans are bad. It's really the problem of a certain group who happens to be in control of policy in that area in the United States. So, for instance, one of the ugly things that happened this year was I wrote what I described in one of the articles I wrote. There was an attempted coup at the IMF. When I say a coup, it was, there was an attempt to fire the head of the IMF, who was very strong in environment, very strong in concern about her poverty, but she was not liked by a lot of people in Wall Street because she was different from the traditional IMF role of the debt collector for Wall Street. And she said, that's not my job. And they didn't like it. They said, no, your job is to be the debt collector for Wall Street. And so we had a conflict. The U.S. Treasury sided with, it wanted to fire her. But some of us rallied Europe and got people in Congress to put pressure, got people in the national security to say it would be disaster if she were fired, and we won. So that was an example where we beat back U.S. Treasury. It doesn't happen very often, and that's why I celebrate it. It was a big thing, but it shows that we still live in a democracy in the United States, and sort of interventions of that kind can succeed.
One last question.
Hi, such a fan, so thank you for being here. So I have two questions, but I'm only going to say one. As this is a critical academic congress, I want to know what can be made in order to have more pluralist economic academia. Because all of what you are saying, I find it fantastic. However, it's not the mainstream. It's not what they teach us here, and it's not what in any economic school is going to be taught. So I want to know your view in that.
Yeah, that's a good question, and obviously, I think my ideas should be taught more. But let me put it the following way: well, an optimistic note. Things are much better now than they used to be. The way I wound up doing the kind of research I did was when I was a graduate student, we were taught the standard competitive equilibrium model. That's all there was. And I listened to it, and I grew up in Gary, Indiana, which is a steel town, marked by a huge amount of inequality, worker strife, racial discrimination, you name it, we had it. It was pollution. I worry that I don't know how many years of my life expectancy is taken off because of that dirty air that I breathed for 17 years. So anyway, I could go on. The models that I was taught had nothing to do with the reality that I saw. And the interesting thing is, I think for some of the kids who grew up in rich suburbs, rich cities, the nirvana that was described by the model is what they had lived. They were in the upper 1% that was going up there. And they say, oh, this is a beautiful system. It's serving me well. But the models, nobody even talked about inequality at all. So that is what, motivated a lot of my work. And I looked at the models, and I said, this does not correspond to what I see with my eyes. And the question was, where did it go wrong? And how do we change it? And then many of the ideas, one of the things, when you take the central assumption that I focused a lot of my attention on was imperfect information. And people in Chicago would say, we know the world doesn't have perfect information, but a world where information is not too imperfect, it's approximately well described by a world with perfect information. That was a religious belief. They had no science behind it. And one of the things I proved, and one of the reasons I did it the way I did, was to show that even epsilon imperfection of information totally changed everything. So I knew that there were many assumptions that were wrong, rationality, behavioral economics, but my research strategy was directed at showing that if you take all their assumptions and just change things in a way that is very plausible, it totally changed the results. Like another example that I've been working on more recently is in models, DSG models with rational expectations, growth models, where everything converges smoothly. I changed one assumption, which is people live finite lives. Now, when you get at my age, you realize that that is actually true. At your age, you may not realize that, but it is true that you become more aware of finiteness. And it is an assumption which I think is more plausible than the assumption that people live an infinite life, right? And you change the assumption from infinite life to finite life, and all the results change. There are an infinite number of rational expectations pass. There are booms, busts. There's a lot of instability. So part of what I did was to try to stay within as much of the framework as one could and show it was not robust. And now, so that's one way of trying to get the conventional wisdom to move a little bit. One of the things, I mean, you're living in a much better world than I did, because behavioral economics has also become much more accepted. And again, it began with people saying, well, what happens if there are costs of processing information? And then you say, well, then they don't behave. That was Kahneman and Tversky. But the more recent work that I've done and some other people have been doing is to say, look, at our beliefs and our preferences are socially determined. You know, what happens? We are a social science. And, you know, one of my criticisms of standard macro is it begins with Robinson Crusoe. The interesting thing about Robinson Crusoe is it's not a society. It shouldn't be taught in a social science. One person is not a society. If you look at Robinson Crusoe, if you read that book, I don't know, what do you know about Robinson Crusoe, about it? He had another person called Friday. And his relationship with Friday was not a market relationship. What kind of a relationship was it? It was basically a power relationship. And there was a lot of endogeneity of preferences and beliefs that were going on, and learning that was going on. So I guess, you know, my answer to you, I don't know the full answer to the question of how you can become, you know, move in the direction, but I think one of the ways is slowly and working first within the paradigm and showing that the paradigm is not robust. And the second one, as you see that, you start pushing out at the boundaries and including things that were taken as exogenous, making them endogenous, and pester your professors enough to make them at least give courses that incorporate this stuff.
Well, as a Congress, we want to thank you for your presentation and for your participation in the second Critical Congress of Economics and Administrative Science. It's a really honor, sir. And un aplauso, por favor. Bueno, muchas gracias a todos los que vinieron. Espero que les haya gustado lógicamente la presentación y terminamos con el Congreso. Muchas gracias a todos por su asistencia.